Some people come into your life with an easy smile, a light conversation, and a frightening ability to observe every detail of what you do. At first it seems normal. They ask questions, pay attention, they seem interested, until something starts to bother you. It's not something obvious. It's not a big red flag. It's more like a vague feeling, a small distortion in the air, as if every conversation had a purpose that you still cannot identify. And if you've ever felt this, you might have thought you were overreacting. But there is a possibility that few people consider. Some people aren't trying to trust you. They are trying to test you. Think about that for a second. While you are having an ordinary conversation, laughing at something banal, commenting on your day, the other person may be silently watching, not to get to know you, but to measure you. Gauge your reaction. Measure your patience. Measure how much you can handle. And here's the first thing few people understand about social manipulators. They don't start by controlling. They start by experimenting. Like a scientist who observes behavior before interfering, they throw little situations into the environment and wait to see what happens. Perhaps a subtle provocation, maybe a bit of a confusing story, perhaps a promise they never intended to keep. Little things, things that go unnoticed. But they are not random. These are tests. And there's something uncomfortable about that. Something most people feel before they even know it, be able to explain. Because when someone is testing you, the interaction stops being human. It becomes a social experiment. You stop being just someone in that person's life. You become a behavior being analyzed. Now I want to ask you a simple question, and be honest with yourself. Have you ever had the feeling that someone was watching your reactions? In a way, much more calculated than seemed normal? Maybe in a friendship, maybe in a relationship, maybe at work. Someone who said they trusted you, but at the same time created small situations strange. Situations where you needed to prove something. Prove loyalty. Try patience. Prove you were on their side. If this has ever happened to you, there is a good chance that you have experienced something psychology calls manipulative social testing. And these tests are rarely clear. They happen subtly, almost invisible. Because experienced manipulators know something most people never know. Understand. Human behavior reveals much more when a person thinks that no one is analyzing. So they provoke, they watch, they wait, and sometimes they do this for weeks or months before showing any intention real. Now stop for a moment and observe your own life. Observe the people around you. Is there someone who seems to create weird little situations? Someone who unexpectedly changes their behavior just to see how you react? Someone who seems too interested in your emotional responses? Maybe now you are remembering someone specific, and if you are, you've already started to notice something important. Because anyone who has gone through this type of experience usually recognizes a pattern, a subtle but constant pattern. First comes curiosity, then come small provocations, then come situations where you need to choose a side. And when you choose, people watch, silently, analyzing every detail. But here's the really disturbing part. These people are not trying to find out if you are a good person. That would be too simple. They are trying to find out how much you can be used. Take a deep breath for a moment, because this next sentence could completely change the way you see some people around you. Manipulators don't trust anyone. Never. Trust requires vulnerability. And vulnerability is something these people have learned to avoid at all costs. So instead of trusting, they test. Test repeatedly. They test silently. They test until they understand exactly who is in front of them. And here's something curious. Most people never realize they are being tested, because the tests are small, almost banal, a contradiction in a conversation, a strange request, an unexpected emotional situation. And while you're trying to keep the conversation going, trying to be polite, trying to be understanding, the other person may be collecting data about you, about your weaknesses, about your limits, and about something even more important. It's predictability. Because for a manipulator, predictability is power. If he can predict how you react, It can influence how you act. Now let me ask you something else. Do you think you would recognize someone like that if they were in front of you? Most people believe so. They imagine manipulators as cold, obvious, almost caricatured people. But the reality is very different. Many of the most effective manipulators seem incredibly normal, charismatic, funny, kind regards. They know how to listen. They know how to praise. They know how to create a connection. But while they do all this, they are also analyzing it, constantly, silently, as if each conversation was a small psychological laboratory. And this is where something unsettling happens. Because when someone notices that you react in a certain way, they start to repeat situations, just to confirm, just to be sure. Have you ever seen someone tell a strange story, and then watch their reaction with exaggerated attention? Have you ever seen someone provoke a small conflict, and then act as if nothing had happened? Have you ever seen someone praise you intensely, and then suddenly withdraw that affection? These moments may seem random, but often they are just part of a larger process. A silent evaluation process, a psychological map being built little by little. And when that map starts to become clear, the game changes. But before we get to that point, there is something that needs to be understood. Because manipulators don't start by dominating. They start by observing human patterns. They want to know who you are when no one is looking, how you react when something unexpected happens, how do you behave when you feel pressured. And the more data they collect, the tests become more accurate, more specific, more targeted, until at some point the person stops just testing and start using what you learned. But this raises an important question, a question that may be uncomfortable, but necessary. If manipulators are constantly testing, how exactly do these tests work? And even more disturbing, how many times have you participated in one of these tests without realizing it? There is a very common idea about manipulators that, in practice, is completely wrong. Many people believe that these people trust themselves absolutely, what are naturally confident, dominant, almost immune to any kind of doubt. But behavioral psychology shows something quite different. Most social manipulators do not operate from trust. They operate from uncertainty control. This changes everything, because when someone doesn't truly trust the people around them, the way to feel safe is to reduce the unpredictable. And there is only one efficient way to do this. Testing, observing, repeating situations until human patterns become clear. Now think about something simple. When you meet someone new, what usually happens? Conversations are spontaneous. The answers are natural. There is room for surprise. But for a manipulator, surprise is a problem. Surprise means loss of control, and loss of control means risk. So they do something very specific. They begin to turn social interactions into small experiments behavioral. It may seem like an exaggeration when you first hear it, but studies of subclinical psychopathy show a curious pattern. People with low levels of effective empathy often develop a skill very strong strategic reading of behavior. They don't feel deeply what you feel, but they can observe with frightening precision how you react. And this creates a very particular type of social intelligence, an intelligence that is not based on emotional connection. It is based on analysis. It's almost like watching someone solve a human puzzle. Now imagine someone like that entering a social setting, a circle of friends, a new job, a relationship. For most people, that is just coexistence. But for a social predator, it can function as a data collection field. Humans, who is impulsive, who seeks approval, who avoids conflict, who has difficulty saying no. This information seems small, but when combined, they form something powerful. A psychological map. And experienced manipulators know exactly how to build this map. They ask seemingly innocent questions. They tell stories that provoke a reaction. They introduce small contradictions into conversations. And then, they watch, silently. Now let me tease you with an idea that may have never crossed your mind. Head. Sometimes when someone asks a seemingly casual question, the question is not the main point. The reaction is, do you respond too quickly? Do you hesitate? Do you try to please? Do you confront? each answer reveals something. And manipulators know this. But here comes a detail that makes everything even more unsettling. These people rarely take just one test. They repeat the test, with small variations, because a single behavior can be an accident. But patterns are predictable, and predictability is the most valuable currency for anyone who wants to manipulate human environments. Now imagine this happening over weeks or months. Little situations popping up here and there. Small tensions, little curiosities, nothing big enough to arouse suspicion, but enough to generate a reaction. Maybe you're listening to this right now and thinking, that seems a bit extreme. And this reaction is completely normal. Because most people start from a very simple principle. If someone is talking to me, they are probably being sincere. But social predators operate under a different logic. They are not just interested in conversation. They are interested in the information hidden within the conversation. Now, I want you to do a little mental exercise. Remember a time when someone asked a strangely specific question about you. Something that seemed out of context. Maybe about how you react when someone disappoints you, or how you usually deal with conflict. Or even something seemingly innocent like, are you the type to forgive easily? These questions may seem like just curiosity, but for someone who is analyzing emotional patterns, they are data. Data on limits, resistance data, vulnerability data. And here's something that many people discover too late. Manipulators are not just interested in getting to know you. They want to know how you can be led. And when they start to notice patterns, something changes in the dynamics. Because at that moment the manipulator stops just observing. He begins to confirm hypotheses. For example, if he suspects you of avoiding conflict, it creates small tense situations. If you retreat, hypothesis confirmed. If he suspects you are seeking approval, he offers compliments, then remove it. If you try to regain approval, hypothesis confirmed. This process may seem almost scientific, and, in a way, it is. Some psychologists call this social instrumentalization. People are no longer seen as complex individuals, and they come to be seen as predictable systems of behavior. Now stop for a second, and notice something important. This type of analysis requires something that not every manipulator has. Patience. Impulsive manipulators exist, of course, but the most dangerous are the patients. Those who can observe for a long time before acting. The ones who seem incredibly calm as they gather information. And that's why many victims of manipulation describe the same feeling retrospective. They say something like, at first everything seemed very normal. But then, looking back, they notice something strange. Little moments, small situations, small tests, which at the time seemed insignificant. But today they form a very clear pattern. Now think about the following question. If manipulators use tests to reduce uncertainty, what exactly are they doing? Trying to find out. The answer may be uncomfortable. They want to find out 3 fundamental things about anyone around them. First, if you have clear boundaries. Second, if you react emotionally easily. And third, if you can be influenced. And this is where the story starts to get darker. Because the first tests are just observation. But when a manipulator realizes that someone is emotionally predictable, the tests begin to change shape. They stop being just curious, and they start to become provocative. Little lies, little broken promises, small changes in behavior. Nothing big, nothing dramatic, but enough to provoke a reaction. Because it is at this moment that the manipulator begins to observe something very specific. How do you react when reality stops being stable? And the answer to that question, it can completely determine the role you will play in that person's life. But before understanding this, we need to look much more closely at one thing, the first tests, the ones that almost no one notices. There is a curious moment in any relationship with a manipulator, a time when everything still seems normal. But little things start to change, happen, nothing dramatic. Nothing you can point out clearly, but enough to create a slight feeling of strangeness. The first tests are almost always like this. Small ones, almost invisible, and exactly for that reason, Extremely effective. Because most people believe that manipulation starts with something big, a serious lie, an obvious betrayal, clearly toxic behavior. But experienced manipulators know that if they start like this, they will be discovered. Fast. So they do the opposite. They start slowly, with something so small that your mind doesn't even consider it a problem. For example, imagine someone who makes a simple promise, something banal, maybe arrange a meeting, maybe help with something, maybe send an important message, and then the person simply doesn't comply. No clear explanation, maybe a vague comment, maybe a quick apology, maybe just silence. For most people, this just looks like disorganization, but for a manipulator, this can be an extremely valuable test. Because the silent question is not about the promise. The question is, how do you react when someone breaks a small agreement with you? Do you confront? Do you ignore? Do you try to justify the person's behavior? Do you pretend you didn't notice? Each answer reveals something. Now imagine this kind of situation happening more than once. Maybe not exactly the same, but with small variations. A promise here, a contradiction there, an unexpected change of attitude. Nothing big enough to seem like a real problem, but enough to generate reactions. And that's exactly what the handler is waiting for. Reaction, because reaction reveals limits. Now I want you to stop for a moment and think about something from your own life. Any situation where someone did something strange, and you were trying to understand if was that really weird or if you were exaggerating. Maybe you thought, it must have been by accident. Maybe I'm reading it wrong. It's not worth making trouble. If you've ever been through something like this, you're not alone. In fact, most people react exactly this way, and manipulators know this. They count on it. Because human beings have a natural tendency to avoid social conflict. We would rather explain the strange behavior of others than confront it, and it's exactly this tendency that makes early testing so effective. Now let's look at another common type of test. Provocative questions disguised as curiosity. Maybe someone will say something like, "I always found it curious how some people forgive everything." Or else, "You seem very patient. I don't know if I could be like that." At first glance, this seems like just talk. But watch carefully. These sentences are not just comments. They are emotional probes. Small stimuli designed to provoke a response. Do you defend yourself? Do you agree? Do you try to justify it? Do you laugh and change the subject? Each reaction reveals something about your emotional makeup. Now there is a third type of test, which is even more subtle. Unexpected changes in behavior. One day the person seems extremely close, attentive, interested. The other day, distant, cold, almost indifferent. When this first happens, many people think it's just stress, personal problems, tiredness. But manipulators observe something very specific at this moment. They watch how you react to the withdrawal of attention. Do you try to recover the connection? Do you ask if something is wrong? Do you start trying harder? If the answer is yes, the manipulator learns something important. He learns that attention can be used as a tool of control. Now, I want to ask you a direct question. Have you ever found yourself trying to regain the attention of someone who suddenly seems distant? Maybe sending more messages. Maybe trying to be more pleasant. Maybe trying to understand what he did wrong. If this has ever happened to you, breathe. Because this type of situation is much more common than it seems. And it doesn't mean you're weak. It just means you are human. But for a manipulator, this behavior reveals something extremely valuable. Emotional predictability. And when someone becomes predictable, he becomes easy to influence. Now there is something even more curious in the first tests. They rarely happen in isolation. They appear in small sequences. A broken promise, then an unexpected compliment, then a moment away, then a deep conversation, all mixed up, as if the relationship was always changing temperature, warm, cold, hot again. This alternation is not random. It creates something called mild emotional confusion. And when the human mind is trying to make sense of a confusing relationship, It tends to invest more energy in that relationship, more attention, more interpretation, more effort. Meanwhile, the handler continues to watch. Now imagine this going on for weeks. Small tests here, little teases there, small changes in behavior. Nothing big enough to make you leave the relationship, but enough to reveal more and more about who you are, about what bothers you, about what you tolerate, about what you ignore. And little by little, a psychological portrait begins to form. Now comes the most disturbing part, because at some point, the manipulator stops testing just to understand you. It starts testing to classify you. And this classification is silent. It is never said out loud, but it exists. In very simple terms, the manipulator begins to ask himself 3 questions. First, does this person set limits? Second, does this person react emotionally easily? And third, can this person be led? Depending on the answers, the manipulator's behavior changes completely. With some people, he withdraws. With others, he gets even closer. And when he decides to get closer, it means something important happened. It means that in the silent tests, he found something he was looking for. A pattern, an opening, a vulnerability. But before understanding what happens after that, there is something that needs to be revealed. Because manipulators don't do all this by showing who they really are. Quite the contrary. While they test you, they are using something extremely sophisticated, a social mask. And that mask is often the reason why so many people take so long to realize what is really happening. There's a reason why so many people live with manipulators for years, without clearly understanding what is happening. It's not just that the tests are subtle. It's because, while these tests are happening, something much more sophisticated is at work. Operation, a mask. And we're not talking about a simple mask, the kind that anyone uses to appear polite or pleasant in social situations. We all do this at some level. We adjust our behavior depending on the environment. At work, we are more formal. With friends, more relaxed. With family, more authentic. Isso é adaptação social normal. But in the case of social manipulators, the mask works differently. It is not just adaptation, she is strategy. Because while silent testing takes place, the handler needs to ensure a very important thing. Let no one suspect. So he builds a persona, sometimes charismatic, sometimes kind, sometimes incredibly reliable. Often, the person even seems more empathetic than average. She listens carefully, remembers details about yourself, shows interest, and at times it can even seem deeply understanding. But there is something curious about this. Because that empathy doesn't always come from an emotional place. It can come from an analytical place. Some researchers describe this phenomenon as a split between 2 types of empathy: emotional empathy and cognitive empathy. Emotional empathy is when you feel what someone else feels. You notice pain, and it touches you. You notice sadness, and something inside you responds. Cognitive empathy is different. It is the ability to understand what someone is feeling, without necessarily feeling it. Together, it's almost like looking at a map. You can identify the terrain, but you don't need to walk through it. And manipulators often develop this ability very strongly. They learn to identify human emotions accurately: fear, lack, anger, insecurity. All of this becomes readable, as if it were a silent language. Now imagine someone who can read emotions easily, but doesn't feel the same emotional weight that most people feel. This creates a very peculiar position in social interactions, because this person can predict reactions, anticipate behaviors, and adjust the image itself according to what is most effective. This is where the social mask begins to take shape. It is not random. It is built on the people around it. If the environment values kindness, the manipulator becomes kind. If the environment values trust, it becomes trustworthy. If the environment values humor, it becomes fun. The mask adapts, almost like a social chameleon. Now let me ask you a question that may seem strange at first. Have you ever met someone who seemed too perfect in social interactions? Someone who always seemed to know exactly what to say, exactly how to react, exactly when to praise? This kind of social skill might just be charisma, But in some cases, it could be something different. This could be someone who has spent a lot of time studying human behavior. Now, there is an important detail here. The mask is not just to please, it serves to protect the testing process. Because while everyone sees a nice, balanced, pleasant person, the little social experiments keep happening. Broken promises, behavior changes, provocative questions, all of this goes unnoticed because the general image of the person seems positive. And this creates something extremely powerful in the human mind. A psychological phenomenon called the halo effect. When we perceive someone as likable or trustworthy in one way, we tend to assume that this person is also trustworthy in other aspects. So when something strange happens, the mind does something curious. She defends the positive image. He must be tired. She probably didn't mean it. Maybe I misunderstood. And while this happens, the manipulator gains something extremely valuable. Time. Time to keep watching. Time to keep testing. Time to understand more and more about who you are. Now there is another important element in the construction of the mask. Selective consistency. Manipulators rarely show behavior problematic events for everyone around same time. They choose environments, they choose people, choose moments. For some, they are incredible. For others, strangely difficult. This creates something even more confusing for those who start to notice signs. Because when you try to explain your experience, other people say, "No, but he was always so nice to me." And suddenly, you start to doubt your own perception. But here's something that many people discover too late. The mask doesn't have to fool everyone. She just needs to deceive enough. And while most people only see the surface, testing continues to happen behind the scenes. Now let's look at something even more interesting. Even with all this strategy, manipulators are not completely safe. There is a quiet emotion behind much of this behavior. Fear. But it's not the kind of fear we normally imagine. It's not fear of rejection. It's not fear of judgment. It's something more specific. Fear of losing control. Because for someone who relies on social predictability, the unpredictable is dangerous. A person who reacts unexpectedly. A person who sets clear limits. A person who doesn't play the emotional game. These types of people break the system. It becomes difficult to map, difficult to drive. And manipulators realize this quickly. Sometimes in just a few interactions. Sometimes in a single moment of confrontation. When this happens, something curious may emerge. The mask changes. Sometimes it becomes more intense, more charming, more convincing, as if the manipulator was trying to regain control of the situation. But other times, the mask simply moves away. The person becomes distant, uninterested, almost as if he had lost interest. And many people interpret this as something personal, like rejection. But in many cases, the truth is different. The handler simply realized that this specific target is not easy to lead. Now there is a point in the dynamic where everything starts to escalate. Because so far, the tests have been light, broken promises, behavior changes, subtle provocations. But when the manipulator decides that it's worth continuing to invest in the relationship, tests begin to change. They stop being just curious, and they start to become more emotionally intense. Small conflicts begin to appear, small distortions of reality, small situations where someone needs to prove something. And this is when many people enter territory that is much more difficult to understand. A territory where the manipulator is no longer just observing. He's starting to move the pieces on the board. And when that happens, tests are no longer just subtle. They start to become cruel. There is a point at which the manipulator's behavior changes quality. So far, the tests have been small, almost invisible, things that could easily be mistaken for distraction, confusion, or simple glitches human. But when a manipulator decides that it's worth continuing to invest in someone, something starts to escalate. Tests are no longer just curious. They start to become emotionally provocative. And this happens for a very specific reason. Up until now, the handler was collecting information. Now he wants to observe how you react under real emotional pressure. because anyone can appear strong when everything is calm, but human behavior changes when the environment becomes unstable, so the manipulator creates instability, small at first, almost imperceptible. For example, he may mention someone else's name strategically, maybe casually comment on someone who supposedly likes him, maybe compliment someone else in front of you in a strangely intense way, maybe tell an ambiguous story about a conversation you had with someone. Nothing explicit, nothing you can easily confront, but enough to provoke a small internal reaction, a doubt, an insecurity, a need to better understand what is happening. This type of behavior has a name in the psychology of relationships: triangulation. It's when someone introduces a third person into the emotional dynamic, not because that person is really relevant, but because it generates comparison. Y comparação gera reação. Now imagine the handler watching. He watches if you show jealousy, if you ask questions, if you try to compete, if you try to look better. Each reaction reveals something. But this is just one of the tools. There is another one that appears with surprising frequency: the subtle distortion of reality. Maybe you say something in a conversation, something simple, and sometime later the handler claims that you said something else, something similar, but different. When you try to correct it, he responds calmly, "No, that's not what you said." Or maybe, "You're remembering it wrong." Or even, "You are exaggerating a little." Now imagine this happening over and over again. Little moments where your own memory starts to be questioned. At first, most people don't notice the pattern. They simply assume there was confusion. But for the manipulator, these moments are extremely informative, because the silent question is, do you defend your own perception of reality, or do you start to doubt yourself? This type of test may seem cruel, but for the manipulator, it serves a purpose. Discover who maintains psychological stability and who begins to waver. Now there is another type of situation that appears frequently at this stage: artificially created conflicts, small disagreements that arise in strange ways. Perhaps the manipulator will interpret something you said in an exaggerated way. Maybe he's offended by something very small. Maybe it creates a climate of tension for no clear reason. And then he watches. Do you apologize quickly? Do you try to explain? Do you feel guilty? If the answer is yes, the manipulator learns something extremely valuable. He learns that guilt can be used as a tool. Now stop for a second, because there is something very important here. If you've ever been in a situation like this, it doesn't mean you were weak. Reacting emotionally is part of the human experience. Feeling doubt, guilt, insecurity, all of this is part of any real relationship. But for someone who is analyzing behavior as a system, these reactions become strategic information. Now imagine this process happening over and over again. Triangulation here, distortion there, small conflicts, small tensions. Each situation works as another test, and little by little the manipulator begins to assemble something inside his own mind. A control map. He begins to understand which emotions work best for you: insecurity, guilt, need for approval, fear of losing the relationship. Each person responds differently, and manipulators know this. That's why two manipulators can act completely differently, depending on the person they are dealing with. They adapt the strategy. Now there is a specific moment when something decisive happens. It is the moment when the manipulator realizes that certain emotional stimuli provoke predictable responses. When that happens, he gains something extremely powerful: psychological levers. He knows that if he acts a certain way, you will react a certain way. And when this pattern repeats itself a few times, the manipulator begins to be sure. Certainly that behavior was not an accident. It was standard. And patterns are manipulable. But not everyone responds the same way. Some people confront, some people walk away, some people set clear limits. When this happens, the manipulator quickly notices, and he often loses interest, because people who don't react predictably are difficult to control. But when someone responds predictably, when someone tries to keep the peace at any cost, when someone accepts small distortions to avoid conflict, Then the manipulator realizes something important. He found fertile ground. And this is where something really disturbing happens. Because at some point during this process, some people start to break down. Not in a dramatic way, not visibly, but internally. Confidence begins to wane. Emotional security begins to waver. The person starts to think twice before reacting. Start asking yourself, am I exaggerating? Did I get it wrong? Am I the problem? And manipulators recognize this moment almost instantly. They notice when someone starts to doubt themselves. Because at that moment, the balance of the relationship changes. The manipulator no longer just provokes reactions. It starts to influence emotional decisions. But before this process progresses completely, there is something curious that many people only realize later. An invisible pattern that had been happening since the beginning. A pattern that reveals who the manipulator chooses to keep close, and who he decides to discard. There is a strange moment when someone starts to see the pattern. It's not a big shock. It's not a dramatic revelation. It's more like when your eyes get used to the darkness, and suddenly you begin to notice shapes that were previously invisible. Small details, small repetitions, small situations that, in isolation, seemed insignificant. But together, they form something much clearer. And many people reach this moment the same way. They start to look back, for old conversations, for situations that happened months before. And they notice something uncomfortable. This wasn't random. There was a pattern. Maybe you're listening to this right now, and some memory has popped into your mind. Some strange conversation. Some behavior that never made much sense. Some situation in which you left wondering why you were feeling confused. If this has happened to you, stop for a moment. Because this feeling of confusion is not accidental. It usually appears when someone has been exposed to a sequence of stimuli, inconsistent emotions, and manipulators use exactly this type of environment. Now imagine a relationship where some things happen over and over again. Seemingly innocent questions, but that arise whenever you seem sure of yes. Small crises that appear out of nowhere. Exactly when the relationship seems stable. Intense compliments, followed by silence or coldness. These alternations create something very specific in the human mind, a kind of state of constant search for stability. The person begins to try to understand what is happening. Start adjusting your own behavior. Start investing more emotional energy in the relationship. And while this happens, the manipulator continues to watch. Now there is an extremely revealing detail in this process. Manipulators rarely invest energy in people they cannot influence. Think about it calmly. If someone tries to manipulate you and realizes that their attempts have no effect, the interest decreases. Because manipulation demands return. It demands predictability. It demands emotional responses. If these answers do not appear, the effort ceases to make sense. And that's why many people report something curious. They say that after setting clear boundaries, the manipulator simply disappeared, or lost interest, or it suddenly became cold, as if something had suddenly changed. But in reality, what changed was just one thing. Emotional predictability no longer exists, and without predictability, there is no control. Now I want you to notice something very important. When someone starts to notice this pattern, two things can happen. The first is denial. The mind tries to protect the image it had of the relationship. She tries to find alternative explanations. Maybe the person is going through problems. Maybe it was just a misunderstanding. Perhaps this is all an exaggeration. This mechanism is extremely common, because accepting that someone has been manipulating emotional situations requires facing something uncomfortable. The second possibility is quieter. Awareness begins to emerge. The person begins to notice details that previously went unnoticed. Small questions that seem like probes. Small tensions that arise at specific moments. Small distortions that seem to test one's own perception of reality. When this level of consciousness appears, something curious happens. The manipulator also notices, because manipulators are extremely sensitive to changes in behavior. If before you reacted one way, and now you react another, This attracts attention. Maybe you stop justifying certain attitudes. Maybe you stop getting into certain arguments. Maybe you'll start responding more neutrally, or simply start observing more. And when that happens, the manipulator feels something he rarely admits: loss of clarity. The person stops being predictable. And when someone stops being predictable, they stop being easy to lead. Now there is something even more interesting at this moment. Many manipulators do not react immediately. They watch. They test again. Maybe they create a little situation to see if the old pattern returns. Maybe they'll do some light teasing. Maybe they will try to recover the previous dynamics. But if the answers continue to be different, something changes. Because manipulators deep down are always making a silent assessment. Is it worth continuing to invest energy here? This question can completely determine the future of the relationship. If the answer is no, the handler can simply reduce contact. It may disappear gradually, can direct attention to someone else. But if the answer is yes, if the manipulator realizes that there is still some emotional openness, so he might try something different, something more intense. And this is where many manipulative relationships enter even more complex territory. Because after testing, after observing, after mapping emotional patterns, the manipulator reaches a decisive moment, a silent moment, a moment that almost no one notices when it's happening. The moment he decides what role you will have in his life. Some people are classified as helpful, others as disposable. Others are too unpredictable to be controlled. And depending on this classification, the handler's behavior can change completely. But there is a disturbing detail in all this. This decision is rarely communicated. It happens in the mind of the manipulator, silently, and when it happens, the entire game changes phase. Because from that point on, the manipulator is no longer trying to understand who you are. He believes he already understands. Now he starts to act accordingly or with this conclusion. And this can lead to something very curious, something that many people describe years later, when they finally understand what lived. They say something like this: "It was as if the person had decided who I was, without ever asking me." But the manipulator doesn't need to ask. In his mind, the tests already gave the answer. And when a manipulator believes he has found that answer, he makes a silent decision, a decision that determines whether you will be someone he tries to control or someone he prefers to avoid. There is a silent question that accompanies this entire story, a question that may have been echoing in your mind since the beginning. Why would anyone do all this? Why test people this way? Why observe, provoke, distort small situations just to analyze reactions human? Most of the answers out there are too simple. Some say manipulators do this out of spite. Others say it's pure ego. But behavioral psychology shows something deeper, something much more uncomfortable. Manipulators don't test people just to control. They test to classify the human world around them. Because, for someone who sees relationships as systems of emotional power, each person needs to occupy a clear place on the board. Some people are seen as helpful, others as irrelevant, others as dangerous. And there is a specific category that manipulators look for with special attention: vulnerable people. But vulnerability here does not mean weakness in the common sense. It means something more subtle. It means someone who reacts emotionally in a predictable way, someone who tries to maintain harmony at any cost, someone who prefers to doubt themselves before confronting strange behavior of others. Now think for a moment. Do these characteristics seem negative? In truth, no. They often come from very positive human qualities: empathy, patience, ability to understand others, desire to avoid unnecessary conflicts. These qualities build deep friendships, healthy relationships, strong communities. But to a manipulator, these qualities may seem like something else: open doors. Now I want you to take a little deeper breath before continuing, because there is something important that needs to be said here. If you've ever found yourself in a relationship where these tests happened, that doesn't mean there is something wrong with you. In fact, many people who have gone through this type of experience have exactly the characteristics that make human relationships possible: sensitivity, empathy, ability to trust. And manipulators recognize these qualities with frightening precision. They understand who is more likely to invest emotionally in relationships, who cares about maintaining connection, who tries to understand others before judging them. These people are not weak, they are human. But when they meet someone who sees relationships as a game of control, the dynamic may become distorted. Now, there is a point in the story that almost no one talks about, because it's not comfortable. But it is essential. Manipulators are not just looking for people they can control. They are also trying to avoid a specific type of person. Those that don't enter the game, people who observe patterns, who ask direct questions, that establish clear limits. This type of person represents a problem for the manipulator because it breaks the predictability system. She reacts in unexpected ways. She does not accept distortions of reality. She doesn't desperately try to restore harmony when something strange happens. She simply watches and decides. And manipulators recognize this quickly, sometimes in just a few interactions. This is why some people report a curious experience. They say that certain individuals seemed extremely interested in them at first, but suddenly they lost interest. No explanation, no conflict, no drama. The relationship simply cooled down. In many cases, this happens because the manipulator noticed something. He realized that that person did not react in a predictable way. He realized that the tests were not producing the type of response he expected. And when that happens, the manipulator does something extremely pragmatic. He looks for another environment, another group, another emotional target. Because deep down, manipulators aren't looking for true connection. They are looking for psychological advantage. Now I want you to think about something. How many times in your life have you tried to deeply understand the behavior of someone, trying to find logic where perhaps real empathy never existed? How many times have you revisited conversations in your head, trying to figure out where you went wrong? How many times have you tried to fix a relationship without realizing that maybe the other one person was just conducting emotional experiments? If any of these questions touched anything in your from you, know one thing: you are not alone. Many people go through experiences like this, and many of them only understand what really happened much later, when they start to look back and notice the pattern. Now comes the most important part of this whole story, because recognizing this pattern changes something fundamental. It changes the way you observe human behaviors. You begin to notice when questions feel like probes, when conflicts seem manufactured, when compliments seem like tools, and when silence feels like calculation. But there is a crucial detail here. Noticing these patterns does not mean becoming suspicious of everyone. It does not mean living expecting manipulation in every interaction. It just means developing something that many people never have the chance to develop before. Psychological clarity, the ability to observe human relationships with more awareness, to understand when something is not aligned, to trust not just words, but standards. Because words can be carefully chosen, but patterns reveal intentions. Now imagine the impact of this on your life. Imagine recognizing early when someone starts introducing small tests, when someone provokes emotional reactions just by observing, when someone alternates proximity and distance in a calculated way. Realizing this completely changes the game, because manipulators depend on one thing to operate: psychological invisibility. They need their tests to look natural. They need people to doubt their own perception. They need the emotional environment to remain confused. But when someone starts to see the pattern, this invisibility disappears. And when that happens, something curious emerges. Many manipulators simply lose interest, because manipulation works best when no one realizes it exists. Now there is one last thing worth reflecting on. Something simple, but deeply revealing. Manipulators are not looking for trust. Trust requires openness. It demands reciprocity. It requires emotional risk. And emotional risk is something they avoid. What they are looking for is something different. They look for predictable vulnerability. They look for people whose emotions can be mapped, whose behavior can be anticipated, whose reaction may be provoked. But when one becomes aware of these patterns, something changes. The person stops reacting automatically. Start observing. You start to choose when to respond and when to simply not play along. And at that moment, the manipulator realizes something. He realizes that the tests have stopped working. And without working tests, control disappears. Now I want to ask you one last question. A question that may change the way you observe certain relationships from now on front. What if some people who passed through your life weren't trying to trust you, but trying to figure out if you were easy to control? This question can be uncomfortable, but it can also bring something extremely valuable: conscience. Because when you understand how these psychological games work, something interesting happens. You stop being just an unconscious participant in emotional dynamics, and he begins to become someone who observes, who understands, that decides. And maybe that's exactly why manipulators avoid certain types of people. Not because these people are aggressive, not because they are cold, but because they learned something simple and powerful. They learn to recognize when someone is not trying to build a relationship. You're just conducting a test, and when you recognize that, the game changes completely. Now tell me something. Have you ever noticed someone testing your reactions in this way, even if in a subtle? If something in this video reminds you of a specific experience, please write to us comments just one word: I noticed. Sometimes noticing is the first step to breaking invisible cycles. And if you know someone who always tries to understand human behavior more deeply, maybe this video also makes sense to that person. Share with her. Because the more people learn to recognize these patterns, the harder it becomes for manipulators to operate in silence. And if you made it this far, observing every detail of this conversation, maybe it's because you've already realized something that many people haven't realized yet. Not everyone who approaches is looking for connection. Some are just trying to figure it out: who can be used, and who is too smart to play the game.